In this video, we're going to go back to the promotional film that Cheshire Police posted on YouTube regarding Operation Hummingbird. This was released very shortly after the conviction of Lucy Letby. This is a continuation of this video that I made some time ago, which dealt with the first part of this Operation Hummingbird promotional film. I'd really intended to continue before now, but so much has gone on, I just never got round to it. But I thought it would be a good time to look back at what Cheshire Police said about their investigation right now. So if you want to see the first part of analysis of that promotional film, then this video is the place to go. But we're going to start approximately 7.5 minutes into this so-called documentary, as they like to pretend it is. So it begins this section with Paul Hughes saying the following. So the three things we wanted to try and draw together medically: what happened, do we have a murder, do we have a naturally occurring death? So I've mentioned this numerous times on the channel, but Paul Hughes doesn't seem able to comprehend or even contemplate that it doesn't necessarily have to be that binary. There doesn't have to be either a murder or a definitively naturally occurring death with a clear-cut explanation. This is partly due to poor reasoning skills on his behalf, and it's partly due to a lack of medical understanding. I think it's clear that Cheshire Police became very confused about a death being unexplained, and because they invited in Dewi Evans, who's gone on the record as saying no death should ever be unexplained under any circumstances, and they'd met with the paediatricians on the 15th of May in this infamous meeting, and the paediatricians had basically said, we couldn't find an explanation for any of these deaths. They're not able to understand, seemingly, that there won't necessarily be a clear-cut explanation for every single death that occurs, particularly among children, especially among babies, and then really significantly among these premature neonates that we've obviously discussed at great length on this channel. So Paul Hughes is already looking at this binary way of, do we have a murder or do we have a naturally occurring death? When even those two things, it's possible conceivably that there could have been a murderer on the unit. But those two things are not mutually exclusive. There could be a murderer and there could be naturally occurring deaths. Or indeed, there could be a complex, nuanced picture of medical issues among some very vulnerable infants with a particularly difficult acuity for an audience, for a unit of this expertise. And of course, that's exactly what we have. We have the complex picture. But Paul Hughes is just looking at this very simple way. I would suggest the reason for that is because that's how they usually look at things. Is there a crime or isn't there a crime? And it's so obvious to us by now that intellectually they were just nowhere near up to the job required. That's no excuse for them to have ignored these National Crime Agency, not directions, but certainly advice. I think to a great extent they were directions, but certainly they received guidance from the National Crime Agency that they somehow managed to ignore, that they definitely should not have ignored. There's no excuse for that, no matter how stupid they are, but it's clear that they just did not have the intellectual capacity to deal with his investigation. And the very first sentence that Paul Hughes speaks in this section is indicative of that. So Paul Hughes continues. Secondly, what did that shift look like? So already we can see they're starting to lean into the shift evidence. There's going to be mentioned in this video, and when we go over further episodes of this promotional film, we'll see that it comes up quite frequently. So they're looking at the shift already in the comments here from Hughes, that it's almost as if he's already decided that there was a murder, because why are you looking at the shifts? Otherwise, you should be looking at the medical picture of the infants. So already they're looking, already hinting at, already leaning into this statistical study that I use the term study loosely, this shift chart they've put in the court case that shows, it was always Lucy. And then he continues from there. That was the timely bit, because you take in statements of nurses and doctors, and then the analytical part, which was phenomenal work done by Claire and Kate on building that factual evidence, which is, we know that Lucy Letby was present. We know, more importantly, that other people were not. Yeah, the problem is, as we know, your entire process for identifying the suspect was this circuitous thing that I've demonstrated before, but I'll show it again now. So this is the circuitous diagram that I've shown before. So let's just go through this again briefly. So this all begins with the paediatricians, Breary, J. Ram, and to a lesser extent Susie Holt, firstly feeding the suspect, Lucy Letby, to the police in that meeting on the 15th of May. They practically identify her. It's possible, based on the notes, that they literally identified her, but I suspect there's a typing error. I suspect they didn't identify her literally, but they made it absolutely clear who they suspected, and you couldn't possibly fail to identify Lucy Letby from that conversation. Also, days before that, the paediatricians had fed the dates that they considered to be suspicious to the police. So the police then dutifully, in point 2 here, restricted the investigation to those dates. That's an absolute fact, because we've got that in their internal documents. We also believe very strongly, I'd say there's overwhelming evidence now, that they completely limited their investigation to Lucy Letby. She was the only suspect, and nothing else was ever considered. So they then allowed the paediatricians to select the cases for the police. Now, what are the chances that the paediatricians are going to select cases that don't involve Lucy Letby? The police then feed the dates and the suspect to Dr. Evans. So we know that they fed him the dates. That's an absolute fact. That's in black and white. We've got that in their internal documents. And they also definitely mentioned, again, we've got this in black and white, that there was a nurse suspect. So Dr. Evans, in this point, we're now at point 4 of this absolutely calamitous process. Dr. Evans only examines this period, and he already has the idea of a nurse in mind because he's been told about that. And then we see these strange comments from him about where is the nurse at this point in time. He's asking the police to confirm the location of the nurse, as he describes it. Now, his claims that he didn't know it was Lucy Letby may be true. We can't prove otherwise, but there's obviously a distinct possibility they did know that Lucy Letby was a suspect. But regardless of that, he doesn't need to know the location of any nurses. He just needs to look at the medical information. So eventually, Dr. Evans goes through the process that I've discussed in other videos that we have internal documents on again, and he tells the police to go back and find out who was on duty for the cases that he eventually deems to be suspicious, although he changes his mind on several cases. So then the police go back to the paediatricians to find out who was on duty for the period that the paediatricians themselves had outlined to the police, and then the paediatricians feed the suspect and the dates back to the police in this perfect, circuitous process that could only possibly have come up with one outcome. So that is the basis on which Paul Hughes is saying, we know that Lucy Letby was present, we know more importantly that other people were not. And that can seem like a superficially convincing argument, and indeed it seems to have been a superficially convincing argument both in court and in the immediate aftermath of this conviction. I must say that it never really convinced me, but we now know how this was derived, and we know how flawed the process was. So then we move on to Claire Hartnell, who's taken something of a backseat since this video was released. We've not really heard from her or seen her again, but she was an intelligence analyst on Operation Hummingbird. According to Claire, an analyst would have been in the past expected to take part in strategic work in terms of establishing threat areas across the force, but also deployed to operational responsibilities. So for me, essentially that's completely meaningless. It certainly has no relevance to the Lucy Letby case. Claire continues. So in turn, if there was a series of burglaries or drugs conspiracy being involved in looking at the data behind that, which supported that investigation and trying to really interrogate that data, see what it tells us, what evidence it gives us, and put that into a project to help the investigation team discern if it's a proactive job or if it was reactive, putting that together as a product so that the investigation team, any prosecution service, and then ongoing into the court process and actually understanding that information and preparing a sequence of events which may involve call logs. It might be maps of locations or might include CCTV, but this job hasn't been like that. So I just want to remind people at this point that this video is supposed to be Cheshire Police telling us what evidence they used to convict Lucy Letby. That is presumably the purpose of this video. I mean, essentially, that is just a load of waffle that has nothing to do with the Lucy Letby case at all. But I think we can conclude from this that Claire, for example, will have looked at the swipe card data, more than likely. So was she one of the people responsible for reversing the swipe card data? We may never know, but it's a distinct possibility. So Claire continues, primarily it was a case of looking at what data was available at that time. Mainly it was, and still is, medical records. We soon found out that a lot of that medical data was scanned in PDF format, and it was just going to be a manual extraction of data. So these are the kind of critical details that Claire has chosen to convey to us, like the file format of the medical records. And I think Claire's one of the more sensible people in this documentary who really doesn't say anything stupid, but also she doesn't say anything of great substance, it must be said. So I just had to apply the methodology to just reading through and picking it out manually with this investigation. Your mind, your subconscious, is constantly searching for the reason for it not to be her. So, I mean, that's a kind of noble statement from Claire. And I really wish that I could believe that, I mean, it shouldn't just be the subconscious mind, it should be the conscious mind as well. I suppose you just say that. She says the mind and the subconscious. I'd love to believe that everyone involved in Operation Hummingbird was constantly searching for the reason for it not to be Lucy Letby. But the problem is, you created a situation where you could only find Lucy Letby guilty. There was no other possibility because of the methodology that you used. And certainly you didn't look at other possibilities. So I used the word binary earlier. It should never have been a binary proposition of, is it Lucy Letby, is it not Lucy Letby? It should have been a nuanced, detailed, complex, multifaceted investigation that looked at numerous aspects of the hospital, the background to the consultants, and all the various other things that I've investigated on this channel. But it's very clear by now that they didn't investigate any of those things. They just gave the notes to Dr. Evans. They fed him a load of information after the cases had been selected by Breary and J-Ram. Dr. Evans said, oh yeah, this is malfeasance, but to be honest, I decided that in 10 minutes or less anyway, and I told you that. And then he selected the cases that pointed to Lucy Letby, and then the paediatrician said, oh yeah, it's Lucy Letby. So I think Claire is very sincere, and I'm not saying that some of the other officers weren't sincere, but I think there's a serious danger, particularly among those who were centrally involved, that they became far too excited about investigating a big case and got completely carried away. It seems to me that Claire, who's quite a calm speaker in the video and seems like a thoroughly reasonable person, I'm sure that she did constantly search for reasons that it wasn't Lucy Letby. And we will never know what she did, and we'll never know her role in it, and we'll never really be, unless the logs are released, which seems highly unlikely because Cheshire Police are going to desperately defend themselves now because they know they've made a complete pig's ear of the whole investigation. That's very clear. But we'll never know Claire's role, but it may be that by the time this arrived with her, there was very little she could have done to stop it. And that the guide rails for the investigation are really the key to what occurred, rather than her work, which may have been very, very diligent. Obviously, someone in the analytics and intelligence has reversed the swipe card data at some point. I don't know if that was Claire, or if she played a small part, and if she played no part in it. But someone has made a pretty major mistake there, and there are other mistakes that I would point to. But I think Claire has probably done her best, but we'll just never know what potential she had to draw the appropriate conclusions on what she was instructed to do and what she was able to do within her remit. So then she continues, you go months just methodically working through overlaying, creating sequences, and then you read something and just like it wounds you a bit. But I think, gosh, she really has done this. And you think then you kind of have to separate yourself out from how you feel about it. Just like you've got to do the work, you've got to give it justice as to what's happened. You've got to remain impartial. And then that's how how I've managed to continue for nearly 6 years that I've been working on it. So I don't have too much to say about that other than I'm sure Claire is absolutely sincere in everything that she said there. Just unfortunately, the methodology of the investigation has rendered this just fatally flawed. So then Paul Hughes appears again and says, I'm going to declare now its criminality. So there's a strange comment, I'm going to declare now its criminality, but it's just really essentially an example of him being inarticulate. Tell parents, so we're going to bring parents in and tell them for the first time, we think their babies have been murdered and attempted to be murdered. Many with twins, triplets, siblings, all affected. So even in his own words there, he's acknowledging that there were a lot of multiple pregnancies and a lot of multiple births in these indictment infants. It's just unfortunate that was never factored into the investigation in any meaningful way, except that the prosecution tried to use it against Lucy Letby by saying that she was targeting families. But the actual medical aspects of it were never part of the investigation. And to be fair, Ben Myers could have done a lot better job of citing this as well, in my opinion, certainly from what I've seen. So already they're starting to talk about the families. In the first part of this documentary, we saw them begin by immediately talking about the families, and quite a bit of this section is dedicated to talking about the families. All indicative, certainly in my opinion, of the fact that they became far too involved with the families far too quickly. They became emotionally involved, and increasingly over a period of time, they saw their job as getting a result for the families rather than doing what they should have been doing, which was dispassionately investigating the actual situation at the County Chester Hospital. So then we hear from Michelle Burkett, who explains that she's a family liaison officer. Michelle says, we initially went out to speak to, I think, about 28 families. Then we were all given a formal words. I couldn't make formal words out clearly. The transcript says she said formal words. So I don't quite know what she said. Maybe she means some sort of formal statement. To explain to the families that there will be an investigation. From this period of time your child was born there, or sadly some of them passed away there, we will be looking into the circumstances around that. I'm also from the IRS and coordinator, so the families were told very little at the beginning because we didn't know anything at the beginning. So Michelle makes this claim that the families were told very little at the beginning. But I mean, I obviously believe firstly that they jumped into this far too quickly. We know it's not only as well, I've discovered, it's not only that they informed the press within 3 days, the 15th of May meeting, they were already meeting with the families within 24 hours. So I've included this in my book and demonstrated this and shown what the police said about this. So they almost immediately decided to do a formal investigation and then immediately went and told the families that there was something suspicious. And as much as Michelle is saying here, we didn't tell them much at the beginning. Well, you didn't tell them specific details because, as you say, you didn't know anything. But you've clearly stated to the families, we have suspicions that your infant has been deliberately harmed. Otherwise, why would there be an investigation? So then it goes back to Paul Hughes. And again, we'll see this theme of them just talking about the families continually. Horrific for the parents to have to deal with because, in my view, in a case that has gone on like this for so long, they've dealt with the loss of their child. And then again and again and again, it's more trauma each time we do something, each time we arrest, each time we make a decision. So it's actually good of him to recognise that. I would believe there was more sincerity behind this statement if he hadn't put those other cases in court recently that the Crown Prosecution Service rejected, and you upset all the parents in relation to that. and then you made this extremely disingenuous statement about no one else should upset the parents and respect their privacy when no one else knows who they are anyway. And then you criticised the Crown Prosecution Service essentially for throwing the cases out. So I think this would be a fair comment if we didn't know what we know now. As it is, it's hard to take this statement seriously. Each time we charge parents reliving that point, I had a difficult decision to make, in fact, the hardest decision to make of my career. Now, I don't doubt that, Paul, for 1 second. I'm sure it's an incredibly difficult decision. It's also the worst decision of your career. I think it's fair to say that, at that time, and probably still, do I arrest Lucy Letby for multiple murders and attempted murders? So we're going to come back to that later in this discussion. This sentence, do I arrest Lucy Letby for multiple murders and attempted murders? So we will see the significance of that statement as we continue. So then Simon Einstein Blackwell makes an appearance. So come to 2018, we're at the point in the summer where we were in a decision where we had a suspect. We believed there was criminality that had happened against a number of babies, some of which had died. And the next stage then, balancing risks and rewards, was to arrest, and the fact that arrest and against the potential ramifications of saying publicly, because the arrest would become public, that we have a child serial killer. So that is not something that you want to get wrong. Hold on a second, Simon. I'm confused. I'm not sure if you remember this, Simon, but you appeared in this Netflix documentary quite recently. Now, what did you say in that Netflix documentary, Simon? You said we had no choice other than to arrest Lucy Letby. Now, obviously, we knew that was total crap at the time, but let's look back at your two statements on this matter. So here in 2023, you're saying we're at the point in the summer where we were in a decision where we had a suspect. We believed there was criminality that had happened against a number of babies, some of which had died. And the next stage then, balancing risk and reward, was to arrest, and the fact that arrest and against the potential ramifications of saying publicly, because the arrest would become public, that we have a child serial killer, so that is not something that you want to get wrong. And then what do you say in 2026, Simon? We had no choice other than to arrest Lucy Letby. Now, admittedly, what you said in 2023 is an absolute mouthful of waffle, but what you're essentially saying is it was a difficult decision whether or not we arrested Lucy Letby. And then 3 years later, in the Netflix film, you claimed that you had no choice. We knew that was crap. We knew that was bullshit. We knew that had absolutely no basis in reality. But we also know that 3 years previous to that, you said something completely different. So then we return to Michelle Burkett. Families were all told of the first arrest. You're knocking on the door and you're turning their lives back upside down again. They've already gone through the bereavement of saying goodbye to their last child, and then you're knocking on the door and telling them, well, somebody's responsible for your baby not being here anymore, or somebody's responsible for what's happened to your daughter or son and the condition that they're in now. So let me say, with regard to that, you shouldn't be saying, obviously Michelle's speaking off the cuff and it may not be entirely accurate what she's saying, and we don't know what was said at the time. But what she's implying here is that the parents were told somebody is responsible for your baby. I mean, she says that quite explicitly. Not, we have a suspect and we're asking her some questions. Remember that when they first arrest Lucy Letby, and you'll see them claim later on in the documentary, oh, we arrested Lucy because we wanted to ask her some questions because she knows more about this investigation, this issue and what occurred at the hospital than anyone else. Of course, we know now that they asked Lucy loads of questions and they completely discarded everything she said. So the idea that it was a fact-finding mission is complete rubbish. We also know that Paul Hughes had said, well, we'd basically decided Lucy was guilty anyway when we first arrested her. And here we see Michelle Burkett echoing that, indicating that basically she seemingly had decided, and that the general feeling at the Cheshire Constabulary at that time was that Lucy Letby was responsible. So far from going into that first arrest with an open mind, and they already gave Lucy an impossible task of having to explain everything that had occurred on the neonatal unit, but not only that, but they didn't really even go into it with an open mind anyway. The reaction there is disbelief, sort of numb, because some of the families had gone on and raised money for charity for the unit and just couldn't believe that somebody could be, responsible for what's happened to them. And then some of the families knew something was wrong, knew something wasn't right. I knew my child was not right. So there's a few things to respond to there. The first thing that I'll say is, remember, this is supposed to be Cheshire Police telling us why they have investigated Lucy Letby and been instrumental in committing her to what at this time was 14 life sentences. It'll become 15 life sentences. Sorry, not life sentences, full life orders. So you're supposed to be telling us why this has happened. And really, what you've told us throughout a lot of this documentary, and particularly in this section, was how sad and upset the families were, which is entirely understandable. No one would expect anything different, and no one can feel anything other than sympathy for them. But that should not be the purpose of this film. The purpose of this film should be to tell us how you conducted the investigation and why Lucy Letby is guilty. And you've told us nothing useful about that at all. The second thing I will say is, this notion of the families knowing something was wrong and knowing something wasn't right, obviously there are so many problems with this. I could probably spend 10 minutes talking about it, but firstly, they're not the most objective assessor of this, are they, given it's their children? You've essentially seeded them with the idea something is wrong, and then pestered them until they believe something is wrong. And in some cases they started feeding back recollections that were inaccurate, and then you use that as evidence in court. An extraordinary process. And then of course they can't know something was wrong. That's exactly the kind of thing a parent will say. And I understand that mothers in particular have an incredibly strong bond with a young infant, having carried that infant in their womb for 9 months, but that doesn't give them an extrasensory perception into knowing that something is wrong and knowing what was wrong. That's just not true. That just is the kind of thing we tend to believe superstitiously as human beings, but there's no basis for that. They're not generally... I believe there's actually one GP who is one of the parents, and hopefully one day she'll be able to look at this dispassionately. But none of the other parents is medically qualified, so they can't possibly know that something wasn't right. There's just no basis for them to say that, and for this to be given credence by someone who's gone to interview them, who's part of the police investigation effectively, is extraordinary and completely wrong. So Michelle continues, family liaison officers were brought in as a point of contact between the family and the investigation, rather than a family member having 12 different detectives phoned in on with 12 different bits of information. They have a single point of contact. So this is all perfectly reasonable, but again, this is just telling us how you dealt with the families. I don't think that is central to anyone's concern. Of course, the families are an important part of the whole picture, but this is supposed to be about Operation Hummingbird. Operation Hummingbird is the investigation into a neonatal unit. Of course, we know it's not the investigation into a neonatal unit. It's the deeply flawed investigation into Lucy Letby alone. But you're supposed to be telling, that's what it is billed as on YouTube. It's billed as Operation Hummingbird, an investigation by Cheshire Police, etc., etc. Not Cheshire Police tell you about the families who were affected by Operation Hummingbird, which is what this video actually is for the most part. So it'd be disappointing if we didn't get an appearance from Danielle Stonier, but here she is. You are the link between the investigation and the families involved, so the victim side of the family. I'm Detective Sergeant Danielle Stonier. I've got 18 years service and I currently work on Operation Hummingbird. It's a really, really difficult and challenging role. Hold on, let me just rewind a second. So she's saying I currently work on Operation Hummingbird. So really, they always had the intention of making this continue, didn't they? Because they weren't for 1 second looking at winding it down, were they? They wanted to continue. They wanted to bring more charges. That was always their intention. Not I worked on Operation Hummingbird. I work on Operation Hummingbird. But let's continue. It's a really, really difficult and challenging role, but also really rewarding as well. I wonder if you'd reassess that really rewarding part now, Danielle. So you're there to kind of keep them updated about the investigation, speak to them, and gather any evidence that they've got to offer. If you need to get statements, a lot of these families haven't had any involvement with the police in general, let alone investigation. So it's about making sure they understand every step of the process and feel supported and that they feel informed. So do you see how much of this is about the families? That's just another bit that's just entirely about the families. I don't think we've heard, I guess in this entire section there's the statement about the statistical commonality, and there's one throwaway comment about, was it a murder, was it natural causes? They didn't provide any evidence in relation to that, but I suppose that was related to the investigation to some extent. There's nothing else to do with any evidence or anything about the investigation. And it actually shows the kind of credulity of a lot of people in that when this video came out, it did attract some positive comments. How it attracted positive comments, I have no idea, because it is so amateurish and poor. I can't see how anyone could possibly think that it achieves its stated aim. But some people were taken in by it, which says a lot about those people, I would suggest. So Danielle continues. It's not all done on day one, it's done in little steps. First, initial contact is made, and sometimes you can be the one that's actually breaking the news, that you're knocking on the door of somebody, very aware that you're going to change their life forever. You are there giving them bad news that their daughter, son has been killed, and we take them through the whole process, break them down into pieces. The mortuary, it's been the circumstances of how they have died. I'm sure that it's a bit of a Freudian slip that she says, break them down into pieces. I'm sure she doesn't mean that they break the families down into pieces. I'm sure she means break the cases down into pieces. But effectively, that is exactly what they've done. They've broken the family down into pieces. In this particular incident investigation, a lot of the family liaison officers didn't have to do that. It was more about explaining to the families what's happening, when it's happening, and why the period of time is sometimes lengthy. So again, there's not an enormous amount to comment on there because it's just a load of stuff, yet again, about the families. And you can see, of all the things they could have put out, you can see how deeply they became involved with the families and how that has clearly, in my estimation anyway, prejudiced the investigation, and it became more and more about the police becoming emotionally involved in this situation and feeling that they have to get a result for the families. We've heard no dispassionate evidence whatsoever in this so-called documentary, in this second part, and there is barely there's hardly any information at all in the entire documentary. But in this part, it is just entirely solely focused on the families and how upset the families were and how we tried so hard to manage the families and look after the families and get a result for the families. Not your job, Danielle. I've been a family liaison officer for a number of years, and no job has been the same, and no family has been the same that I have supported, and it can look very different. People's needs are very different, so it's really important to kind of set out an understanding at the start so they're aware of what they can expect from me, but also what I will be looking at from them. So it can be something as simple as, how often do you want me to phone you to check in? Do you want to be contacted every week? Even if I've got no information, do you still want a call? Or do you just want me to call you with any pertinent points? So I suppose the only thing I need to add there is, it sounds like they were calling them all the time saying, this has happened, that's happened, long before Lucy Letby was arrested. So they've absolutely primed these parents to believe that Lucy Letby is guilty. And then as I've mentioned, the families then started feeding information that they'd never mentioned to anyone previously after they'd been pestered and pestered by Cheshire Police until they start saying, oh, well, actually, I remember this. Then Cheshire Police just uncritically accepted that. You've heard what it was Michelle Burkett, I think, said earlier. Oh, some of them started saying, I knew something wasn't right with my child. So instead of looking at that critically and thinking, well, they can't possibly know, or they're not the best judge of that, they just asked the families, can you give us more information on that? The families gave that information, and then we saw that appear in the court case. So that is all I want to examine from this particular section of the Operation Hummingbird film. But I'm going to go back now and look at some comments that I posted on Reddit. Now, bear in mind, this is a long time ago. This was very shortly after the investigation, as I will discuss at the end of this section, and I just want to show some comments that are made in the first and second part of this documentary and things that I wrote about those comments at the time. So here in the documentary, you can see me, I'm quoting here, but ultimately we've seen many times in investigations like this where we've gone the wrong way. Police nationally have gone the wrong way, jumped into a suspect. Now, my view of that was by investigating that it could be anyone, it means we're not focused on one person. I mean, that's almost comical at this point, isn't it? But I just said, did you investigate other people? Did you investigate doctors? Did you make a presumption of innocence for those that initially contacted you? Now, I didn't know 1% of what I know now, but obviously we know how accurate that comment is now. We know they didn't investigate other people. We know they didn't investigate doctors. We know that they did make a presumption of innocence for those that initially contacted you. When I wrote this, I didn't know they'd had that meeting on the 15th of May with Breary and Jairam. I don't know if I even would have known the names of Breary and Jairam at this point, because this was very, very early on. But I could see in this film all the mistakes that the police have made. We just now know the details of those mistakes. So then I've quoted, you don't often hear of multiple child, baby, infant deaths. They are extremely rare. One is rare enough as it is, and tragic enough, but if you have a number of potential babies who have died or have been harmed, it is absolutely hugely important. So I've said, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but there is a danger here of seeking an explanation when, in fact, the deaths could be entirely random or not satisfactorily explained by a unified cause. Of course, we know all that to be true now. So to hear that there may be allegations of assault or concern, the documentary says, at a hospital in our area was a huge thing. So I've said in response to that, did you question the possible vested motivations for these allegations, or did you assume that they were entirely virtuous? Of course, we know they didn't question the possible vested motivations. They did assume that they were entirely virtuous. This was well before the Thirlwell inquiry started. I had no idea that Nigel Wenham was going to stand up in the Thirlwell inquiry and say the consultants deserve to be believed. I remember going into the office, Cheshire Police state, and when I first joined and speaking to Paul at length, I knew that was going to be a case to answer, because otherwise you wouldn't be gathering people. And then I've said, again, this seems as if you have made assumptions immediately. Of course, we know now how rapidly this investigation gathered pace into an investigation directed solely at Lucy Letby, based entirely on this 15th of May meeting. So then there's this is almost an infamous assertion that we're seeing from the police here. What we found out was in neonatal infants, it's very clear that they know when a baby's going to collapse and die. As soon as I read that, I can remember reading that and thinking, that just sounds like complete crap. I can't believe for 1 second that they would always know when a baby is going to collapse and die. So I hadn't learned, I knew very little about this at the time. I was still learning. Of course, I've learned an enormous amount over the last 3 years. But immediately, my bullshit detector was flashing red as soon as I read that sentence. Even knowing nothing about neonates, nothing about hospitals really at that time, I just thought, come on, that doesn't sound plausible. If a doctor said that to me, I would not automatically accept that. I would think, really? That doesn't sound very likely. So they go on and on about neonatal units. They explain these babies do not die. If a baby collapses, it's usually expected. And even on the outside chance of it being unexpected, it's always explainable. What separated this collection of events away from everything else was they were only unexpected and unexplained, and that was then serving as the key significant factor of me deciding this. So I've just written, this all seems highly dubious to me. Now, of course, what Paul Hughes should have done when he heard this from the consultants is A, question it, and B, do some research. Possibly C, he should have got a second opinion from some other medical person. He did none of that. According to his own words, he decided that was the key significant factor of him deciding this. Of course, I've described it as highly dubious because I didn't really know what I was talking about, but it seemed pretty dubious to me. Of course, we now know it's all absolute rubbish that he's speaking here. So then I've gone on to write the following. That doesn't mean that there wasn't foul play at Chester. It doesn't mean that it's not important to ascertain what has occurred, but something appearing strange or suspicious does not mean that it is, and it's critical to retain impartiality and an open mind at all times. As soon as you begin going down one path, you almost inherently start seeking the information to back up your impression, and that is very dangerous, particularly considering what we know already. It is worrying for me that this speaker is essentially cajoling us into the understanding that we looked at the figures and knew something bad had taken place. This is consistent with something an earlier speaker said. Now, my view of that was by investigating that it could be anyone, it means we're not focused on one person. It may be unfair to isolate one sentence that may be slightly flippant and poorly expressed, but the reality is that it might not be anyone, and even if there is a human cause, it might not be malicious. So at this stage, I wasn't 100% certain that this was a miscarriage of justice. I already very strongly believed that it likely was, but I was still researching and trying to understand, and I knew it was possible at this stage that I would encounter a smoking gun or a red flag that would point to guilt, and I might have to change my opinion, but I'd done a few days research and I was already pretty confident in my instincts that this was going to turn out to be a miscarriage of justice. Obviously, over time, that's become ever more solidified. But even at this stage, I could see the problems with confirmation bias in this investigation that it seems the police themselves were never able to see. So then I've quoted this, and then at the same time, the analytical products have been coming together and the investigative products have been coming together, so reconstructed. So at that point, I knew that in most cases we'd been able to prove already that Lucy Letby was present. There was more work to be done, and I could prove that it was inflicted harm. So I've said in response to that, I don't want to comment on this too much because this has already been discussed in depth elsewhere. But this notion that it was inflicted harm has never been satisfactorily proven. Even if we accept every other aspect of the hypothesis of the police and prosecution for the sake of argument, there is simply no proof that Letby inflicted harm on babies, nor that anyone else did. So that was my impression at that time. That's what I believed to be the case, having already done some research and already seen what people with medical qualifications were saying, and of course that has now been very strongly solidified. Then I quote this: my opinion was very quickly that yes, there was something not right, yes, the only obvious person was Lucy Letby. And I've written again, this to me is a very troubling statement given completely voluntarily. And of course, it is troubling. It not only indicates confirmation bias, it's indicative of how quickly they jump to these conclusions. So then I've quoted, so the three things we wanted to try and draw together was medically, what happened? Do we have a murder? Do we have a naturally occurring death? And in response to that, I've written, did you consider any other explanations? Because it seems continually that you only considered that the deaths could have been entirely innocent or instead due to malignant activity. And of course, I'd absolutely stand by that today. It's very clear, as I mentioned earlier in the video, that they had this binary view of, right, it either needs to be completely explained as naturally occurring or there must be a murder here, which is ridiculously ludicrous. But that's just how they thought, and that's what they were cajoled into thinking, and they allowed themselves to go down that path, and they never investigated any other pathways. And then finally, I've quoted this section that is redolent of the key theme in the section we've discussed in this video. And then some of the families knew something was wrong, knew something wasn't right. I knew my child was not right. And I've written with regard to that, I don't want to be disrespectful to people who have been through horrible experiences, but the emphasis of this sort of comment, and in accordance some pretty dubious anecdotal evidence in court, is either dangerous or should be viewed as having little merit. Naturally, parents will think back, contemplating whether there were any glaring signs when they've been told that someone has potentially killed their babies, although the previous passage suggests that the police told them that someone has killed your babies. If there were clear signs or any serious indications of foul play, these would have been reported by parents at the time. As far as I'm aware, no complaints were ever made against Lucy Letby until she was fingered as a murderer, just as no one has ever seen her doing anything even particularly suspicious, let alone incriminating. I've been in workplaces, in other groups of people, and as soon as something goes wrong in someone's life, the gossiping and revisionism begins. I always knew that there was something wrong with him. I don't necessarily think this is poor investigation, but it's another example of something that is essentially meaningless being cited circumstantially in court and also being used to confirm existing suspicions seemingly. It also seems that the parents were informed of this before Letby was charged. It took over 2 years from her initial arrest to charging, so was this evidence used in the decision to bring charges against her? So I'd completely stand by everything I said there, apart from the fact that I don't necessarily think this is poor investigation. It is poor investigation, Chris, so you're completely wrong about that. But I'd stand by everything else that I said, and I could see the problems. It wasn't difficult. It wasn't difficult to see what they'd done wrong and to see the cognitive bias and to see the confirmation bias and to see the issues they'd had and to see what they'd done wrong and to see the way that they'd seeded the families and then had the families repeat things back. It's just unbelievable. Now, what I will finally say about this is that I wrote this on the 25th of August 2023. So I've ringed here the date that Lucy Letby was convicted, which was the 21st. That was the date the conviction was announced. That was when I walked down to my kitchen and heard about this on the radio for the first time. I didn't know the name of Lucy Letby prior to the 21st of August 2023. Already on the 25th of August 2023, I was able to write these comments, the overwhelming majority of which, in fact, basically all of them, I would stand by completely. The only thing I would say is we now know that what I was saying was true, and some of the things I was a little bit cautious about, I wouldn't be cautious about today because they're completely confirmed. The only thing I would disagree with is that comment I said at the end where I said it wasn't poor investigation. It very much was poor investigation. I don't even know why I said that at the time. But obviously I was being cautious because I wasn't 100% certain it was a miscarriage of justice at that time. So I was still building the picture and trying to understand. So I'll ask you a very simple question. How is it that I was able to work this out in a matter of 3 to 4 days from watching, most of this comes from watching the so-called documentary that's actually a promotional film that was posted on YouTube. I could see from the police's own promotional film within a matter of days all of the mistakes that they'd made. How is it that in a matter of years that they worked on this investigation, they couldn't see them? Even taking into account the fact that I think very few people would disagree that I'm more intelligent than the people that were centrally involved in Operation Hummingbird. I think you'd have to get family members of Blackwell, Stonier and Hughes to have anyone that could possibly disagree with that. But even taking that into consideration, they were working on this full time. They were paid what are pretty good salaries to work on this investigation. They had a lot of resources. They were given a lot of resources. There were a lot of people that they could have spoken to. They can call almost anyone into the police station immediately by virtue of being the police. They had all manner of advantages over me, and there were many other people in this thread as well who were also raising concerns, who were also raising similar questions. Why couldn't they see what was staring them in the face?